Every rise, every fall, every whisper from Eden to Revelation was never random. Hidden in plain sight, a terrifying pattern has been repeating, and it's pointing straight at us. In the beginning, we are told, the Word was with God. But what if the Word was also watching us? Not just ink on parchment, not just commandments etched in stone, but something alive, something that sees. For centuries, people have approached the Bible to read it. Fewer have stopped to wonder if it is also reading them. It whispers in deserts and shouts in cathedrals. It waits in hotel drawers and courtroom oaths. It speaks in fire and silence. No other book has followed humanity like this one, tracking us through empires and exiles, plagues and revolutions. Wherever people go, it somehow gets there first, already open, already knowing. Some say it's just a book. Others say it's divinely inspired. But the terrifying possibility is that it might be both and more. That it might be a mirror you didn't ask for, a test you didn't know you were taking, a signal disguised as a story. There are patterns inside. Cycles, echoes. Names change, but the actions don't. Cities rise, fall, and rise again. Betrayal repeats itself. Miracles fade into murmurs. And still, the voice speaks. Not always loudly. Sometimes only through a line you've read 100 times before, but now it feels different, like it knows you've changed. And perhaps that's the point. The Bible never moves, but you do. And each time you come back, it's like it rearranged itself to meet your eyes where they are now. Some verses burn, some heal, some confuse, but the deeper terror lies in the realization that you are not alone with this text, that something ancient and intelligent might be embedded within the very rhythm of its pages, hiding not in the words but in the space between them. People who've studied it for decades still find new shadows behind familiar phrases. Children hear stories of animals and arcs, never knowing they've just touched the edge of something vast and cosmic. Priests and prophets alike have confessed. The closer they get to understanding, the more they feel watched. What if the Bible wasn't just written for us, but to us? What if every fall, every exile, every redemption and ruin wasn't just history but a warning? This is not just a book. It is a cycle that breathes, a pattern that whispers. And if you look long enough, it begins to look back. Before the flood, before the fire, before the law was written on stone, there was a garden. Eden. Not a myth, not a parable. A place, a boundary between heaven and earth, between what was allowed and what was not. And in the middle of that place stood two trees, one that offered life and one that offered knowledge. Knowledge was the forbidden one. They were warned, not because the knowledge was evil, but because they were not ready to carry it, not ready to see what God sees. But the serpent spoke, not with fangs or fire, but with a question. Did he really say? And in that moment, something ancient unraveled. A decision was made, not just with the mouth, but with the heart. The fruit was taken. The first rebellion wasn't a scream, it was a bite. Quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. They did not fall like stones. They fell like stars burning as they went. Eyes opened, innocence gone, shame introduced like a disease no one knew how to treat. And then the sound, not thunder, not an angel's cry, the sound of God walking. He asked where they were. But he already knew. The question wasn't for him, it was for them. When he drove them out, he didn't destroy Eden. He sealed it. Flaming swords, a rotating guard, a message carved into the unseen. Not yet, which means Eden still exists, somewhere, and it's not empty, because someone stayed behind, a watcher, a sentinel, or something else entirely, not a punishment but a memory preserved, something to witness, something to keep the pattern from being forgotten. Every exile that followed Israel in Babylon, humanity east of Eden, Christ in the wilderness echoes this first expulsion. It's always the same, a place of promise, a breach of trust, a locking of the gate, and someone watching from the other side. We imagine paradise lost. But maybe it's just waiting. Maybe the terrifying truth is that Eden isn't behind us, but ahead, and the one who stayed behind is still guarding it. Not everything was removed. Not everything was forgiven. The garden wasn't erased. It was hidden, and the swords are still turning. It slithered between the roots of the tree of knowledge, but its origin was not of Eden. The serpent spoke with intelligence, with purpose, with an intent far beyond animal instinct. And that should have been the first clue. Animals do not reason. They do not tempt. They do not twist the truth like thread around the throat of a soul. This one did. The Bible calls it a serpent, but elsewhere it is called by other names. The accuser, the adversary, the dragon. And before it ever appeared in the garden, it had already fallen from something higher, cast down, not as punishment alone, but as part of a deeper fracture, one that split the heavens before it ever reached the earth. It knew the rules. It quoted them, not as a servant of God, but as something that once stood in his presence. The serpent's words were not rebellion. They were strategy, the kind of strategy used by someone who had already done this before. And it wasn't crawling. Not at first. Read closely. It was cursed to crawl after the fall, which means before that moment, it stood upright, elevated, glorious, perhaps, like a throne room creature fallen from its post. The curse did not make the serpent evil. It made its form match what was already true in its heart. What entered Eden that day was not just a test, it was a presence, something old, something jealous, not of Adam, but of the image Adam bore, because man was made in the image of God, and the serpent once served near that image. And now it had been replaced. This was not the first temptation. It was a continuation. The serpent in the garden was not simply a snake. It was an echo of a greater rebellion, one that began in the unseen realm, before time had a name, a rebellion of loyalty, of purpose, of place. And when that rebellion spilled onto earth, it did so through questions, not fire. Did God really say? That line wasn't just about fruit. It was about doubt, about rewriting the terms of reality, about placing suspicion where there was once trust. And it worked. The serpent vanishes quickly after Eden, but its voice does not. You hear it again in Job, accusing, in the desert, tempting, in the end, devouring. It takes many forms, many names, but always the same goal: to fracture the pattern, to steal what was never his. The serpent was not just a symbol, it was a sign that something ancient had already declared war on the image of God. And it would not stop until that image was broken, buried, or bowed. They didn't walk out of Eden. They were driven. The gate slammed shut behind them, sealed with flame and fury. East of Eden, where the light dimmed and the wind turned sharp, it was not just a direction, it was a condition, a sentence, a curse. They didn't just lose paradise, they lost the rhythm of innocence. And from that moment forward, the pattern began. Disobedience, banishment, wandering. Cain would follow the same trail, only darker. He spilled blood into the ground, and the ground spat him out. Marked, cursed, and exiled again, this time even farther. A fugitive, not just from home, but from peace. He built a city, as if walls could hush the sound of his brother's voice still crying from the soil. But guilt follows. It always does. Every exile in the Bible is a shadow of this first one. Israel in the wilderness, Judah in Babylon, even Christ in the desert. It always begins with closeness, then comes the breach, then the silence. Eden is not forgotten, it becomes the ache beneath every promise. But there's something else. Something subtle. The exile is not only punishment, it's a boundary, a delay, a mercy, dressed in sorrow. If they had stayed, they would have eaten from the second tree, eternal life without redemption, immortality in corruption. And so, they were pushed out, not just eastward, but away from destruction. Still, they carried something with them, a memory, a shape in the distance. The garden was gone, but not erased. Its imprint lingered in their stories, their longing, their architecture. Temples would later mirror its layout. Priests would guard its symbols. Prophets would speak of a return not to a place, but to a condition. But not yet. Outside Eden, the world was not empty. It was already watching. The ground had rules. The skies had watchers. Civilization rose with echoes of divine memory and twisted imitation. And through it all, the whisper remained. You are not home. East of Eden became more than geography. It became the stage for all history, a place where everything is incomplete, every love fractured, every effort temporary, every soul aching for something it cannot name. This was the beginning of the human story as we know it, not in a garden, but in the dust just beyond it, far from the throne, west of innocence, east of everything we were meant to be. And the flaming sword still turns. It begins like a rumor the earth wasn't ready to hear. In the days before the flood, when the skies were still young and the boundaries between realms had not yet hardened, something crossed over. The sons of God looked upon the daughters of men, and they saw beauty. But what they chose was not theirs to take. They descended, not in fire, but in fascination. They took wives from among them, as many as they pleased. And from this union came the Nephilim, giants in stature, but greater still in hunger, not just for flesh, but for dominance, for worship, for rule. The flood was not sent simply because of human wickedness. It was sent because of contamination. The bloodline had been pierced. The image of God in man had been distorted, reshaped, overthrown by a force that had no right to touch it. What was born from the heavens was never meant to walk the earth, and yet they did. The Nephilim weren't merely large. They were legends, men of renown, feared, adored, obeyed. Their names were carved into stone. Their violence echoed across valleys. Some were kings. Some became gods in the eyes of those beneath them. But heaven watched, and heaven judged. What the Watchers had done, those divine beings who crossed the line, was not just rebellion. It was treason against design. They had taught humans things too quickly, too harshly, too deeply. Secrets of weapons, enchantments, metals, charms. Civilization accelerated, but its soul withered. And so, the skies broke open again. But this time, not for descent, for judgment. The flood came not just to drown wickedness, but to erase what should not have existed. A reset, a purge, a silencing of a generation that blurred the line between mortal and immortal. But here lies the deeper terror. The pattern shows signs of returning. The same hunger for unnatural knowledge, the same obsession with altering what island. The same spirits once drowned whisper again, not in dreams, but in data. Not through giants, but through glass screens and blood codes. The sons of God fell for beauty. The daughters of men were flattered by power. The children born were monsters in disguise. And though the flood covered the earth, not everything drowned. The rain began as a whisper, soft as breath on the skin. But the earth knew. The ground trembled before the sky opened, before the deep places groaned and split. This was not just a storm. It was an undoing. A judgment not aimed at mankind alone, but at something far more ancient that had taken root inside him. Before the first drop fell, there was a decision in heaven. The corruption wasn't just in action, it was in essence. Flesh had been altered. Spirit had been stained. What was made in the image of God had become something else entirely. Men had embraced the forbidden. Beings not born of dust had bred with the daughters of earth, and what they created had no name heaven would claim. The Nephilim giants of terror and legend filled the world with violence, but it wasn't only their size that made them monstrous. It was what they represented. A fusion of realms, a fracture in the sacred boundary, and the earth cried out beneath them. So the flood came, not as a random act of wrath, but as a reset. The waters covered the highest mountains, not to punish, but to purge, to wash, clean the distortion. Every drowned city, every sunken memory, every twisted hybrid thing that once ruled the valleys and claimed dominion over man. All of it swallowed. But the terror is not in what was destroyed. It is in what was preserved. One family, one ark, one sealed remnant of uncorrupted humanity, floating on a sea of judgment. The animals came not just for survival, but to keep the design intact. What God had made, he would not abandon. But what had mutated, he would not mourn. The spirits of the giants, the offspring of heaven's betrayal, did not die like men. Their bodies fell, yes, but their essence lingered, disembodied, wandering. They became something else, something hungry. Ancient texts call them Watcher's children. Others call them demons, spirits of the dead that never belonged among the living to begin with. So the world was cleansed, but not emptied. The flood ended. The waters receded. The ark found ground. But the pattern had been written in water and spirit rebellion, corruption, extinction, and then silence. This was the first extinction, but it would not be the last, because even after the waters fled, something remained beneath the soil, watching, waiting, whispering its way back into the hearts of men. They say it was pride that built the tower, that men gathered on the plain of Shinar to make a name for themselves, to reach the heavens with brick and ambition. But that is only the surface. The deeper story lies beneath the mortar. Babel was not just a monument, it was a mechanism, a stairway carved upward, not in arrogance alone, but an invitation. They weren't trying to become gods, they were trying to speak to them. This was a generation that remembered the flood. The stories of watchers and giants, of things that fell from the sky and mingled with the daughters of earth, were not myths to them. They were recent history, and now, on the other side of the waters, they were trying to re-establish the connection. But this time, it would not be through rebellion. It would be through order, precision, a tower built with exactness, uniformity, a united language, one voice, one system, one focus. It was not the pride that threatened heaven. It was the potential. God did not scatter them because of height. He scattered them because of synchronization. The tower was working. Something was listening. Something above was responding. Read carefully, he says. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. That is not the language of punishment. That is the language of interference. Because what they were building was more than structure. It was signal. And it wasn't the first time. The pattern repeats. Connection, corruption, consequence. Just like Eden, just like the flood. And now again man reaches beyond his boundary, and the boundary answers back. So God confused the language, not as cruelty, but as containment. Division became the firewall. Tongues became the barrier. The scattering was mercy, because the tower wasn't just an act of human unity. It was a message broadcast into realms never meant to receive it. And the terrifying question is, what if something heard it anyway? The ruins of Babel still whisper. The ziggurats of old Mesopotamia, their steps worn by wind and time, stand like broken antennas no longer transmitting, but not fully silent either. The gods worshipped in those cities were not imagined. They were remembered. What Babel started was not just a tower. It was a pattern of trying to bridge the space between man and the divine by force. And that pattern, like a fault line beneath history, continues to crack open. They were building more than bricks. They were rebuilding the ancient connection. the one that caused the flood, the one that turned giants into legends, the one that never really went away. After Babel shattered the unity of language, something deeper shattered too, something hidden. God did not merely scatter the people across the earth. He disinherited them. He let them go. 70 nations were formed from that moment, and over each one, he placed a being from above, not kings, not prophets, watchers. These divine beings were not random. They had once stood in the presence of the Most High. Some had already fallen. Others were loyal at first. Each nation would now be shaped, guided, and tested under the eye of a different power. Cultures were born, borders drawn, and in the heavens, a map was being drawn alongside the one on earth. But God kept one nation for himself, not the strongest, not the wealthiest. A wandering man named Abram was chosen, not because he built towers, but because he listened. From him would come a people not ruled by a watcher, but by God directly. Israel would be the exception. The one thread pulled tight while the rest unraveled. But the watchers, the ones given charge over the 70 nations, did not all remain pure. They began to seek glory, to demand worship. They took the names of gods. They received offerings, and what began as oversight became oppression. This is why the ancient world is flooded with stories of sky gods and mountain thrones, why idols were shaped to match stars, why temples were built on high places. Because the nations were not alone. They were under the rule of beings that once bowed before the throne but now desired thrones of their own. The Psalms say plainly, God stands in the divine assembly. He judges among the gods. These are not metaphors. They are meetings. A courtroom above, where the Most High still holds authority, and where sentence is declared over those who abused their station. But he waits. He does not destroy them outright. Instead, he begins a different plan, one that will reclaim the nations not by force, but by invitation, through Israel, through covenant, through blood. This division was never meant to be permanent. The scattering of nations was not the end. It was the setup, because from the 70 would come one, and from the one would rise a light meant to call them all back. The Most High gave the nations away, but he never forgot them. The watchers who ruled would one day fall. Their altars would crumble. Their names would fade. And the voice that spoke from Sinai, from the bush, from the mountain would one day speak again. This time in flesh. 70 nations, 70 watchers, but only one God. And he was not done. He stood alone under the night sky, surrounded by silence and stars. There was no temple. No choir, just a question trembling in his chest. How can I know? God had promised descendants, a nation, a land, but years passed, and still his tent was empty. So Abram asked, and God answered, not with words, but with a ritual older than language. Animals were brought. A heifer, a goat, a ram, each one split from neck to tail. Their halves laid opposite in the dirt. Blood soaked the earth. Buzzards circled. And Abram waited. This was not a sacrifice. It was a covenant. In the ancient world, when kings made a pact, they passed between the torn bodies of animals, declaring, "Let this be done to me if I break my word." But Abram did not walk between the pieces. He fell into a deep sleep. And in that darkness, something else moved. A smoking firepot, a blazing torch, shapes not of this world, flickering with the weight of divine presence, passed through the blood-soaked aisle alone. Only God walked the path. Only God took the vow. Abram was not asked to prove anything. The covenant was not balanced. It was mercy, unconditional, unshakable. The future of the world was just tied to the promise of a childless man in the wilderness, and the one who promised would bear the weight of both sides. And yet, there was dread. Before the light came, a deep and terrifying darkness fell over him. not just sleep, a shadow of what was to come. God showed him the cost, that his descendants would suffer, that 400 years of slavery would come before the land, that pain would mark the journey, that blood would return again and again. But the torch kept moving. This covenant was different. It did not demand perfection. It demanded trust. And even when trust cracked, the fire did not go out. Abram would become Abraham. His children would become a nation. And that nation would carry the torch forward, even when their hands trembled. What began in the night, in silence and torn flesh, would one day blaze from a mountain, then from a tabernacle, then from a cross. But here, in the desert, with no witnesses but angels and the stars, something eternal was set in motion. The God of heaven made a promise and sealed it with fire. It wasn't just about fire. It wasn't just about sin. What happened to Sodom and Gomorrah was a verdict carried out by something larger than law. The story begins not with smoke, but with visitors, 3 of them, 2 angels, one who speaks like the Lord himself. They come to Abraham with promises of life, but they are also headed elsewhere with purpose, with judgment. God tells Abraham what he's about to do, as though asking permission from the friend he made a covenant with. But beneath the surface, something more ancient is playing out. Not just cities being evaluated, but a cosmic court convening. Because what was happening in Sodom was not isolated. It was echoing too loudly into the heavens. The cries had reached the throne. This wasn't only about violence or corruption. Those cities had become doorways, places where something dark was invited in and welcomed. They weren't just sinning, they were signaling. Like Babel, they were touching something forbidden. And the watchers above had noticed, so the angels go, not to destroy but to confirm. And what they find is not just evil, but obsession. When the messengers enter Lot's home, the city surrounds the door, not for conversation, not for food. They demand the visitors, strangers that glowed too brightly for flesh. What they wanted wasn't intimacy, it was intrusion, a violation of heaven's messengers, and that sealed it. Lot is pulled back inside. The angels strike the crowd blind, but even then, the mob claws at the walls, searching for the door in the dark. There is no repentance, no hesitation, only hunger for what should never be touched. So judgment falls, fire from the sky, not natural, not earthly. This is not lightning, it's something surgical, targeted, as if the ground itself was split open by command. Salt and sulfur. Screams turned to silence, smoke rising like a column of memory. But it wasn't just punishment, it was quarantine. These cities had become too loud, too open. The veil was thinning, and heaven shut it with flame. Lot's wife turns, not just out of curiosity but out of attachment. Her heart still belonged to a place already burning, and she became a monument, a pillar not of salt, but of warning. God's destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't random wrath. It was response. Heaven responds when certain thresholds are crossed, when sin becomes ritual, when the forbidden becomes routine, when the echoes of rebellion reach the ears of the throne again. And sometimes, judgment comes not just to end evil, but to silence a signal before it spreads. He carried the wood on his back, the way a condemned man carries his own cross. His father walked beside him in silence, holding the fire and the knife. Up the hill they went, alone, but not unseen. Somewhere behind them, servants waited. Somewhere above them, heaven watched. And somewhere deep in the earth, something held its breath. Isaac asked the question, the one no son should ever have to ask his father, "Where is the lamb?" And Abraham answered with words that were both prophecy and pain, "God will provide." But when they reached the top, there was no lamb, only stones, only rope, only obedience. The altar was built, the sun was bound, the blade was raised, and in that suspended moment heaven cried out, not with thunder, not with fire, but with a voice that stopped the hand, a voice that named the fear, praised the faith, and pointed to a ram caught in thorns. Substitution. It was more than mercy. It was a pattern, a foreshadowing. The innocent takes the place of the promised. The son is spared, but only because something else dies. The blood still falls. The fire still consumes. But not the one who was supposed to be sacrificed. Not this time. From that mount, Abraham descended with his son, but also with a vision. He named the place, "The Lord will provide." Not, "did provide," "will." As in something still coming, something greater, a future hill, a future son, a future substitution that would not be stopped. The story of Isaac is not just about a test. It is about a template, one that would repeat again and again. In the Passover lamb, in the scapegoat driven into the wilderness, in the blood painted on doorposts, in the rituals of atonement, in every moment where something dies so someone else can live. But there is a shadow in the pattern too, because every substitution is temporary. The ram saved Isaac, but the world kept bleeding. Sacrifices continued, altars filled, priests grew weary, and all the while the question lingered. When will the final one come? The true lamb, the one who doesn't just delay death but defeats it. The mountain where Isaac was almost sacrificed would one day have another name, Moriah. Later, it would become the place of Solomon's temple. Later still, a skull-shaped hill. Same region, same pattern. This time, no ram in the thorns. The voice from heaven had said, "Now I know you fear God, because you did not withhold your son." One day, that same voice would say nothing at all. No stopping the hand, no substitute, only the pattern fulfilled. The stone was cold beneath his head, but the night was alive. Jacob had nothing, no home, no inheritance, only the weight of a stolen blessing and a brother who wanted him dead. He laid down in the dust of nowhere, between the past he ruined and the future he couldn't see. And then, the gate opened. He saw a ladder or something like one stretching from earth to heaven. Not a structure of wood or rope, but a corridor of light and movement. Angels were ascending and descending, not floating, not gliding, moving with purpose, as if on assignment. As if this place, this forgotten patch of wilderness, had become a crossing point between realms, and above it all, not a feeling, not a symbol, a voice, a presence. The same voice that spoke to Abraham now spoke to Jacob, not to destroy him for his lies, but to confirm the promise, the land, the offspring, the blessing. It was still his, not because he deserved it, but because God had already chosen. When Jacob awoke, he didn't say he'd had a dream. He said something terrifying. "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." Then he named it, Bethel, House of God. But what matters most is not what Jacob saw, but where he saw it. There was no temple, no altar, no priest, just a stone pillow and a fugitive heart. Which means the gate between heaven and earth doesn't require sacred buildings. It appears wherever heaven wants to touch earth. It finds the unworthy. It breaks into the ordinary. And it leaves behind a pattern. Jacob's ladder wasn't just a one-time vision. It was a map, a warning, a promise, because the idea of movement between worlds of angels traveling up and down implies access, exchange. And if messengers can come down, then so can something else. The ladder is not only a gift, it is a risk, a reminder that there is traffic above us, that the realms are not as separate as we pretend. Centuries later, a man from Nazareth would tell one of his disciples, "You will see heaven open, and angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man." He was claiming to be the new ladder, the new gate, not just a connection, but the connection. Not a dream in the dark, but flesh walking in daylight. Jacob saw a stairway, He saw the access point. But he didn't know then that the true gate was still coming, and one day that gate would bleed. Joseph dreamed of stars bowing and bundles of grain kneeling. He wore a coat that shimmered like favor made visible, and he walked among his brothers unaware of the storm that was already forming. They did not hate him for his dreams alone. They hated him because those dreams felt real. And if they were real, it meant he was chosen, and they were not. So they tore the robe. They threw him in a pit. They dipped the garment in blood and handed it to their father as proof of a lie. And Joseph was carried away to Egypt, bound in chains, sold as a slave, vanished from the world he once knew. But the story did not end there. In Egypt, the pattern deepened. Joseph was falsely accused, thrown into a dungeon, forgotten by men, but not by God. In the darkness, dreams came again, not his own this time, but the dreams of others. And Joseph, the dreamer once despised, became the interpreter, the one who could read symbols, the one who could see beyond the veil. Then came Pharaoh, a king with troubling visions, and Joseph stood before him not as a prisoner, but as a prophet. He spoke of famine, of plenty and lack, of time measured in sevens. And the king listened. Joseph rose, not by force, but by wisdom. From the pit to the palace, from slave to second in command. And when famine spread across the lands, his brothers came. Hungry, desperate, unknowing, they bowed before him, just as the dream had shown. But this was not revenge. Joseph wept. He tested them, yes, but not for power. For truth, for repentance. And when it came, he revealed himself not in anger, but in mercy. What you meant for evil, he said, God meant for good. The pattern was clear now. The beloved son is rejected, cast out, thought dead. But in exile, he rises, and when he returns, it is not to punish, but to save. It is a cycle written in blood and grace. And Egypt, land of gods, pyramids, and secrets, becomes the stage where the future is rehearsed. A place of rescue and of bondage. A shelter that becomes a trap. What begins with Joseph ends with slavery, and a cry for deliverance. But the shadow lingers, because the pattern of Joseph, betrayal, descent, exaltation is not just history, it is prophecy. One day another beloved son will come. He too will be rejected by his brothers. He too will descend. He too will be thought dead. And when he returns, it will be not to destroy but to redeem. The dream never ended. It was only waiting for its final fulfillment. They came to Egypt as honored guests, invited, welcomed, and protected because of one man's dreams. Joseph had risen so high, Pharaoh called him Father. The family was given the best of the land, a fertile region called Goshen, where they prospered in peace. But time is cruel to memory. Kings die, names fade, and what was once a story of salvation slowly becomes a prison. A new Pharaoh rises. He does not remember Joseph. He does not care about the God who saved his nation through a Hebrew slave. All he sees are numbers. The children of Israel have multiplied. They are no longer a family. They are a people, and to him, they are a threat. So chains are forged. What begins with fear becomes policy. What begins with policy becomes cruelty. The chosen people, once sheltered, are now enslaved. Their backs break under sun and stone. Cities rise from their labor storehouses for grain, monuments for kings, temples for gods that do not hear. They are forced to build the very empire that oppresses them. But the real war is invisible. This is not just about Pharaoh and Israel. It is about power in the heavens. Egypt is more than a kingdom. It is a spiritual machine. Its gods wear crowns of gold and jackal heads, rule from thrones made of myth and magic. The Nile is not just water. It is a deity. The sun is not just heat. It is a god with a name. And every cry from the Hebrews rises into a sky filled with false thrones. The silence that answers is not absence, it is gathering. Because God does not forget. The more they are afflicted, the more they multiply. The harder Pharaoh grips, the faster the promise slips through his fingers. So he turns to genocide. Kill the sons, keep the daughters, let the blood of babies soak the future into the sand. But one baby slips through, placed in a basket, set adrift on the Nile like a question to the heavens. And the river that was supposed to drown him carries him to the very palace of the king who signed his death. The daughter of Pharaoh finds him, names him Moses, raises him among the gods of Egypt, unaware that she is nursing a rebellion into her own house. The pattern is shifting again. A deliverer is growing inside the heart of oppression. Hidden in plain sight, raised by the enemy, called by a voice from fire. Egypt's rise has created its own downfall. And Israel, though shackled, still carries the promise in every breath, every cry, every broken chain waiting to fall. Slavery is loud, but deliverance is louder. The mountain did not simply smoke, it trembled. The ground groaned as if awakening from ancient sleep. Fire licked the sky. Thunder cracked like a voice too large for the human ear. And at the center of it all stood one man, barefoot on stone, eyes lifted into flame. Moses had climbed alone, but he was not alone. Behind him, the people waited at the base. They had seen the Red Sea split. They had watched their oppressors drown. They had followed fire through the night and a cloud by day. But this was different. This was not deliverance. This was encounter. At Sinai, God does not whisper. He descends. The law is not spoken casually. It is carved in smoke and lightning, uttered in syllables that shake creation. Commandments etched not just on stone, but into the structure of covenant. This is not just a code of ethics. It is the voice of the Most High pressing his will into human history. But beneath the spectacle, something deeper is happening. The mountain becomes a portal, a place where dimensions bleed, where heaven touches earth and trembles. The thunder, the fire, the darkness, these are not theatrics. They are shielding. They are mercy. Moses alone is summoned higher. He disappears into the cloud. For 40 days and 40 nights, the people see only the fire. They do not hear the words. They do not know what is being written. They only know absence. And absence breeds fear. So while Moses receives the law, they make a god of their own, a golden calf, formed from their earrings, shaped by their memories of Egypt, a god they can see. A God that does not tremble, a God that does not command thunder. While the true covenant is being etched above, idolatry rises below, and the mountain, still burning, stands between heaven and rebellion. When Moses descends, he carries more than stone. He carries judgment. The tablets shatter on the rocks, not just because the people broke the covenant, but because the covenant was stillborn. Before it could breathe, they had already chosen something else. Yet even in wrath, there is intercession. Moses pleads. God listens. The pattern bends, but it does not break, because this mountain, for all its fire and fear, is only the beginning. There will be another mountain, another lawgiver, another covenant not of stone, but of spirit. And next time, the ground will tremble again, not in fear, but in resurrection. They had heard the voice. They had seen the fire. They had watched the mountain writhe like a living thing as the presence of the Most High descended in smoke and thunder. And still they built the calf. This was not confusion. It was not panic. It was memory. The gold came from Egypt, yes, but so did the idea, the form, the ritual. What they made wasn't just a symbol of impatience. It was a doorway, a return. They didn't want nothing, they wanted what they had known. A God you could see, a God you could shape, a God you could touch and carry and bury if needed. Something manageable, something old. Because the calf was not just a mistake, it was a reactivation, a summoning, a call to powers that had once ruled them, spirits clothed in image and animal and myth. When Aaron shaped that gold, he wasn't just crafting a statue, he was remembering a pattern. Egypt had been left geographically, but spiritually, it still pulsed in their bones. The dancing, the feast, the strange fire. It wasn't just idolatry, it was communion, and not with God. What rose in the desert was an altar to a power the Most High had already judged. It was the face of rebellion draped in gold, polished and paraded like freedom. And still, the mountain burned behind them. Moses returned not with patience, but with shattered stone and eyes lit with fury. The tablets broke not because stone is fragile, but because covenant is sacred, and it had been violated before it was even fully delivered. What was supposed to mark a beginning had already become a grave. But here is the terrifying truth. They still thought they were worshiping the Lord. Aaron said the calf would be a feast to him. The people never claimed they were leaving God behind. They believed they were honoring him just in a way they understood, just in a form they could control. That is the deepest danger of the old gods. They do not always announce themselves as enemies. Sometimes they arrive dressed in familiarity, wrapped in nostalgia, whispering that they are the same, but they are not. The golden calf was more than rebellion. It was spiritual regression, a doorway reopened to principalities already cast down. And in reactivating what God had silenced, they invited judgment not just upon themselves but upon the entire pattern of future worship. Because from this moment on, every idol would not just be an object. It would be a test. Do you want the God who thunders from fire, or the God you can mold with your own hands? One leads to covenant, the other to exile. It began with measurements, cubits, rings, curtains dyed in scarlet and blue, instructions whispered to a man who had stood inside, cloud and fire. Every detail mattered, every clasp and socket, every thread of gold and pomegranate bell. Because what was being built wasn't just a tent, it was a shadow. The tabernacle was not designed on earth. It was shown, revealed, like something already existing elsewhere, waiting to be mirrored below. God told Moses, "Build it according to the pattern you saw on the mountain," not imagined, saw. Which means Moses had glimpsed something not of this world, a structure in heaven, or perhaps beyond it. And now, it had to be recreated with human hands. But this was no ordinary blueprint. The Ark of the Covenant, gold-covered, mercy-seated, flanked by cherubim, was more than a container for tablets. It was a throne, a footstool for the invisible. The Holy of Holies was not just a sacred room. It was the place where time and space bent, where the divine would descend between the wings of fire-carved beings. A portal, hidden behind curtains too thick for light, and a veil too sacred to part. Everything in the tabernacle spoke of separation. Courtyard, altar, basin, holy place, and then beyond that a final veil, a barrier between man and God, life and death, dust and glory. Only one man, once a year, could cross that line. And even then, not without blood, not without fear. This was not intimacy, it was awe, controlled access to something uncontainable. The candlesticks, shaped like almond blossoms, burned continually. The table of bread, 12 loaves laid in waiting. The incense, a cloud rising like prayer. All of it rehearsed a rhythm, not just of worship, but of warning. The holy is near but not tame, and yet God chose to dwell there, inside a movable tent. Not on a mountain, not in a temple, in a fragile structure carried on the shoulders of wandering men. The same God who split the sea, who carved fire into stone, now rested above a box behind a veil. But why? Because the pattern was being planted, a throne among sinners, a king in the wilderness, a presence that does not wait for perfection, but moves with the broken. The tabernacle is a paradox, untouchable glory inside a tent of skin and wood. And one day, that paradox will take flesh. The veil will tear, the fire will walk, and the throne will not be behind a curtain but nailed to a tree, because what was once blueprint was always meant to become human. The wilderness wasn't just a delay, it was a test, a fiery corridor stretched between promise and punishment, where hearts were weighed more than bodies. The journey from Egypt to Canaan could have taken weeks, but what was meant to be a crossing became a crucible. And 40 years later, only bones marked the path of those who failed to believe. They had seen the plagues, they had walked through walls of water, they had eaten bread that fell from the sky, and still they doubted, not once, not twice. Over and over again, murmurs grew into mutiny. At every hardship, they looked back to Egypt not as slaves, but as if it were home, as if chains had been sweeter than trust. God did not abandon them, but He exposed them. Each camp became a mirror. Each trial peeled back another layer of what lived in their hearts. When thirst came, they complained. When hunger struck, they accused. When Moses delayed on the mountain, they made gods of their own. When the promise came close, they sent spies not with faith, but with fear. And when the report returned with giants, they chose to retreat. So the sentence was passed not in fury, but in grief. That generation would not enter. Instead they would wander, circles upon circles, graves dug in sand, sons burying fathers, daughters watching mothers fade under the weight of a covenant unkept. The land waited, silent, just beyond the Jordan. But for them, it would remain a dream. And yet, in the heat and dust, miracles never ceased. The manna still fell, the water still flowed, their clothes did not wear out, their sandals did not break, judgment did not cancel mercy. God still walked with them. A pillar of cloud by day, fire by night. Instruction upon instruction, not to destroy but to teach, to prepare the next generation, to reset the rhythm. The wilderness was a furnace, but it also became a classroom. It was here that the law took root, that the tabernacle was carried from place to place, that worship was refined and leadership tested. Here, the people learned not just how to escape Egypt, but how to stop carrying Egypt inside them. 40 years, 1 year for every day the spies scouted the land, 1 year for every layer of fear that had to be burned away. And when the final day came, when the last elder of that rebellious generation breathed his last, the people stood again at the edge, not the same, not yet whole, but ready, because the wilderness had emptied them, and now the promise would fill what remained. The trumpet sounded, not as a warning but as a declaration. Jericho had watched them circle for days, silent except for the march, the rhythm of footsteps in dust. 7 days. And then, on the 7th, 7 priests raised 7 ram's horns. The air tore open with sound, and the walls collapsed not from siege, but from obedience. This was no ordinary war. Joshua stood not just as a general, but as a continuation. Moses had seen the land but never touched it. Joshua would touch it with fire. He was not given the staff, but the sword. Not the mountain, but the battlefield. And the command was terrifying. In its clarity, drive them out. All of them. Because this land was not just geography. It was a contested space. A battleground of gods. Giants still walked here, remnants of the ancient ones, descendants of the Nephilim, fortified behind cities and blood rituals. What Joshua faced was not merely human resistance. It was spiritual occupation, and the war was sacred. Jericho fell, but not by tactics. Ai fell, but not without failure. because with each victory came a test, obedience, or compromise. At Jericho, everything was to be devoted, burned, left behind. But Achan took gold, just a little, a cloak, a few coins, and the pattern broke. Israel lost the next battle not because of strength, but because of hidden defiance. The purge was not about cruelty, it was about contamination. The cultures being displaced had long been warned. Their iniquity had ripened over centuries. The land itself groaned under their weight. Child sacrifice, ritual perversions, sorcery and blood altars. This was not conquest, it was cleansing, not for the sake of empire, but for the preservation of covenant. But still the violence unsettles, because behind the commands, something larger pulses, a cosmic rhythm echoing Eden. Enter, fail, exile. But now, reversed. Enter, obey, inherit. God was giving them a second chance, a new garden, a reset of dominion. But even gardens must be guarded, and so, the sword was necessary. Joshua obeyed. City after city fell. Territory after territory claimed. But the deeper message wasn't about maps or boundaries. It was about trust. If they followed God's voice, even giants would fall. Even iron chariots would burn. Even rivers would part. But if they turned again, if they let the old gods back in, then the cycle would reset. And this time, the exile would be longer. The conquest was a mirror. It revealed who they were becoming, not just warriors, but stewards, and every drop of blood cried out not for vengeance, but for vigilance. Because the pattern had only just begun, it always started the same way. Peace gave way to forgetfulness, forgetfulness to compromise, compromise to disobedience. And then came invasion, foreign armies crossing borders, gods with strange names rising again in groves and hills. The people would cry out, not always in repentance, but in desperation. And God, moved not by their goodness but by his mercy, would raise a judge. Not kings, judges, rough men, reluctant women, flawed vessels, some brave, some broken, a left-handed assassin, a prophetess under a palm tree, a wild-haired Nazarite driven by vengeance, each one stepping into the pattern like a shadow already cast. The pattern was always the same: disobedience, invasion, cry, deliverer, peace. And then, again, the forgetting. This was not a history of heroes, it was a history of warnings. Israel had no central ruler, no king but God, but that very freedom exposed their hearts. Without a visible crown, they drifted. Without a visible rod, they wandered. And every time God handed them over, it was not abandonment, it was consequence. Not hatred, but correction. The invaders changed. Moabites, Midianites, Philistines. The names differed, but the message remained. If you break covenant, the land will reject you. If you follow the gods of your neighbors will rule you. The blood cried from the soil again and again, until even deliverance grew strange. Gideon asked for signs. Samson broke every vow. Jephthah sacrificed what should have never been touched. And still, the Spirit came upon them, because the point was never their perfection, it was God's faithfulness. But each cycle grew darker. Sin bred not just idolatry, but cruelty, civil war, tribal betrayal, an entire concubine torn to pieces and scattered across the tribes. The closing chapters of Judges read like a slow descent into madness, and the haunting phrase repeats like a bell tolling the end of sanity. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That line is not an observation. It is a diagnosis. The people were not just oppressed, they were unraveling, spiritually, morally, culturally. The judges brought relief, but never restoration. Each deliverance was temporary. Each peace, short-lived. And always the pattern returned. The book of Judges is not about national survival. It is about the fragility of covenant without remembrance, the human tendency to circle back to chaos even after mercy, the terrifying reality that even chosen people can become the very oppressors they once fled. And yet, through the blood, the weeping, the cycles, God did not abandon his promise. He watched, he waited, he whispered through broken people and burning altars that something better was coming. But first, the people would demand a king, and the pattern would shift again. The lamp had not yet gone out. In the quiet, before dawn stretched across the hills, a whisper came. Not thunder, not fire, just a name spoken into silence. The boy stirred, thought it was the old priest, shuffled across stone floors, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Here I am," he said. But Eli had not called. It happened again. Three times the voice came, and only on the third did the old priest understand. His eyes were dim, but he remembered what it was like to hear the divine. He told the boy, "Next time, say this, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" And the fourth time came. The voice did not tremble, it did not soothe, it delivered a warning, a judgment on a house grown fat with stolen offerings and blind to its own wickedness. The boy did not hide. He told Eli everything. And from that moment on, the word of the Lord returned to Israel, not in dreams, not in symbols, but through a child who would grow into a prophet. Samuel's story marks a hinge in the great pattern. The age of judges was closing. The silence of the heavens had been pierced, and the people, tired of the cycle, wanted something they could see. They wanted a king, not a prophet, not a priest, a crown. But God's answer began with a whisper in the dark. Samuel would grow, and his words would carry weight. He would anoint the first two kings. He would weep over one and warn the other. But none of that began in palaces or courts. It began in the stillness of a temple, with a voice calling a child by name. The story does not rush. It listens, because before nations are shaken and crowns rise or fall, God speaks in the quiet, and those who hear must choose to answer, not with certainty, not with strength, just with willingness. The boy said yes, and the heavens opened. He looked like a king, shoulders above the crowd, commanding, handsome, the kind of man people could follow into battle, the kind of man people thought God would choose. But what they got was not strength, it was the illusion of it. Saul was everything they asked for, and nothing they needed. When Samuel poured the oil, heaven did not hesitate. The Spirit came. The signs were clear. Saul prophesied. Saul rallied the tribes. Saul struck down enemies with fury. But inside, something trembled. Not reverence, insecurity, a fear of losing what he barely understood. The first cracks came quietly. A sacrifice offered too soon. A battle won with vows too reckless. Mercy shown where judgment was commanded. And then, worst of all, silence. God stopped answering. Not through dreams, not by prophets, not by Urim. The king stood tall, but the voice of God had withdrawn. Because Saul obeyed partially, and partial obedience is still rebellion. Samuel arrived with fire in his eyes and grief in his heart. "You were small in your own eyes," he said, "but God made you king." And now, because Saul had rejected the word, God had rejected Saul. It was not just a fall, it was a pattern. The people had demanded a crown, and they got one made of sand. Power without trust, authority without intimacy. Saul feared the people more than he feared the Lord. He built monuments to himself. He wept when caught, but never changed when warned. He fought battles, but lost the war within. Even his love turned to madness. David entered his courts with songs and victories. A shepherd, a harpist, a slayer of giants. And Saul, instead of mentoring him, hunted him. The spirit that once rested on Saul had moved, and he knew it. Jealousy ate him alive. Spear after spear thrown at shadows, at ghosts, at the echo of what he could have been. His story ends not with triumph. Alone on a battlefield, surrounded, wounded, Saul, the first king of Israel, falls on his own sword. The man who looked the part but could not carry the weight. The crown is left bloodied in the dirt, because God had not finished writing the story. He was raising someone after his own heart, not a perfect man, but a repentant one. Saul was the chosen mistake, a warning wrapped in royal robes, and the pattern continues. It was supposed to be a moment of joy. The ark was returning, the symbol of heaven's presence, the throne of the invisible king. David, now crowned and battle-scarred, danced before it with all his might. Music rose, shouts echoed. The ground trembled beneath the weight of history, but the pattern does not tolerate casual reverence. The ark had not moved for years, left in obscurity, forgotten by Saul. And now, David was bringing it home to Jerusalem. A new capital, a new beginning, but they carried it the wrong way on a cart, like the Philistines had done. Not on the shoulders of priests, not according to the law. And when the ox stumbled, a man reached out to steady it. Uzzah. His name should have been remembered for reverence. Instead, it became a warning. He touched the ark, and in a blink, he was dead. The celebration stopped. The music choked. Even David, warrior, poet, king, stood frozen in fear. "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" he asked. And for 3 months, he left it in someone else's house, because the ark was not a relic. It was a boundary between heaven and earth, between what is holy and what is common, between presence and presumption. David thought he was honoring God, but intention does not replace instruction. Emotion does not excuse disobedience. Even the chosen must learn to tremble. When the ark finally came, it was different, carried the right way. Sacrifices made every 6 steps. David stripped of royal dignity, clothed only in linen, dancing not for men but for the Lord. He became smaller in the eyes of the proud, but greater in the eyes of heaven. The ark entered the city. Not into a temple, there was none yet. Just a tent, a place of waiting, a reminder that even kings must bow. That power is always dangerous in human hands, and that God's presence cannot be managed, only honored. David had won many battles, slain giants, united tribes. But here, he learned the deepest lesson of all. Sacred things are not safe. The ark was not just a box of gold. It held the tablets of the law, the manna from the wilderness, the staff that had budded with divine life. It was history, warning, miracle, all wrapped in fire. And David, the shepherd-made king, would never forget the price of touching what was never his to hold. It rose like a mountain of light, not built in haste, not shaped by war, but crafted in peace, stone by stone, beam by beam, in silence. No hammer rang within its walls. Everything was measured, precise, prophetic. Solomon's temple was not just architecture, it was a symbol, a throne room for the unseen. The ark had waited in a tent for generations. But now, under the Son of David, it would find a resting place. Gold covered the walls. Cedar filled the air with scent. Cherubim stretched their wings across the inner sanctuary, their forms towering, watching. They were not decorative. They were guardians, echoes of Eden, and above them, the ark, the mercy seat. A throne carved from fear and glory, but no one ever sat there. It was not made for Solomon, not for priests, not for angels. That empty space between the cherubim was the most dangerous silence on earth. Once a year, and only once, a high priest entered with trembling hands and blood on his garments. a rope tied around his ankle, in case he fell dead before the presence, because the presence did not forgive arrogance. It only responded to blood. What was inside? The tablets, yes. The covenant, etched by fire. But something else lingered. A pattern, a whisper. The same power that walked in the garden, that thundered on Sinai, now rested above a golden seat hidden behind veils. And still, Solomon knew. He stood before the people and confessed, "Even the heavens cannot contain you, much less this house I have built." The temple was never for containment. It was for connection, a meeting place, a signal, heaven touching earth, just long enough to remind them who they were and who they were not. But the pattern never sleeps. Solomon, for all his wisdom, began to turn. Foreign wives, foreign gods, altars built in secret corners. The temple still stood, but its foundations had begun to rot from within. Gold cannot cover rebellion forever. And the throne, though empty, had never been forgotten by the one who truly sat upon it. The glory that filled the temple would one day depart. But not yet. For a moment, in the days of Solomon, heaven dwelled in a house made by human hands, and Israel believed the pattern had ended. But it had only paused. She arrived under a sun that burned like judgment, her caravan shimmering across the wilderness like a mirage made real. The Queen of Sheba, ruler of a distant kingdom, keeper of riddles, priestess of 1,000 veiled truths, came not for conquest, nor alliance, but curiosity. Word had reached her of a man whose wisdom defied reason. A king with answers. A temple that hummed with power. A throne of ivory and gold. But wisdom, real wisdom, cannot be bought with gifts. She brought them anyway. Spices that had never touched Hebrew air. Gold enough to shame kings. Stones that sparkled like fallen stars. But none of it was offered blindly. She had questions. Questions the world had forgotten how to ask. Not about crops, or taxes, or armies, but about meaning, justice, the way a soul bends beneath the weight of heaven, the sound a heart makes when it breaks in worship. And Solomon answered her, not with riddles, but revelation. He spoke of the Most High not as theory, but as someone he had met in dreams, someone who whispered through fire and thunder. He explained the architecture of the temple. Yes, but more than that. He spoke of the temple within, the war between flesh and spirit, the pull of bloodlines and the promise of covenant. He told her of his father's harp, of the songs that broke giants and summoned rain. She listened, and she changed. When she finally rose to leave, she looked upon the temple one last time, and it wasn't the gold that stole her breath. It was the pattern she had seen hidden within it all, a rhythm pulsing beneath the surface, a throne never sat upon, a name never spoken aloud, and a God who could not be bribed. What did she carry home? History says tribute. Scholars say trade agreements. But the silence says more. Because long after her departure, legends grew. In lands far south, children were born with eyes like flame and wisdom beyond their years. Scrolls appeared in languages Hebrew scribes could not read, and altars rose in lands where no prophet had walked, yet where his name was whispered still. She came with questions. She left with more than answers. She left with the pattern, hidden, buried, waiting. It cracked like dry earth under a cursed sky. The kingdom, once united under songs and swords, tore in two not with war, but with words. Rehoboam, son of Solomon, stood on the edge of his inheritance and chose arrogance over wisdom. When the people asked for rest, he promised whips, and so 10 tribes walked away. The crown was split, but the fracture was deeper than politics. It was spiritual. The north took the name Israel, but not the presence. No ark, no temple. Only altars in high places, golden calves resurrected from Egypt's grave. Jeroboam claimed it was still the same God. But something older stirred behind the masks. Whispers from Bashan, echoes of rebellion that went back to Eden. And so began the bloodline of kings who never bowed, never repented, never remembered. Not one ruled with righteousness, not one stood in the pattern of David. The south, called Judah, kept the temple but not the heart. Pride thickened like smoke in the holy city. Kings rose and fell. Some cleansed the land, some defiled it. But always, the pattern circled overhead like a hawk waiting for weakness, disobedience, warning, consequence. And when the prophets cried out, they were mocked, beaten, silenced. What split the kingdom also split the covenant. North and south. Two houses, two destinies. And above them, silent watchers waited. The north fell first. Assyria came like a flood. Cities burned. Children vanished into exile. 10 tribes erased, like ink washed from stone. Judah watched and did not learn. The southern kingdom, with its temple still standing, believed itself immune. But cracks had already spread through the foundation. It was never about geography. It was always about the pattern, the divine rhythm of blessing and curse, of rebellion and return. And once again, it was being ignored. The split was not a pause in the story. It was an acceleration. The moment a nation forgets its story, the story remembers them. The Most High was not bound to borders, and the throne above the cherubim had not moved, but the people had, north into idolatry, south into self-righteousness. And the pattern, patient and perfect, continued its march toward judgment. He stood alone on the mountain, wind ripping through his cloak, eyes like thunder. Around him, 450 prophets of Baal danced and bled, calling to a God who would not answer. Hours passed, smoke rose, no fire, no voice, just silence that mocked them. And then Elijah spoke, not with frenzy, not with blades, just 12 stones and a trench, just water poured until the sacrifice was soaked, the wood drowned, and even the earth drank deep. No trick, no spark hidden beneath dry brush. He stepped back, looked up, and prayed not to impress, but to reveal. Then it came. Fire fell from a sky that had not seen rain in 3 years. It did not flicker. It consumed. Stone, water, flesh, everything. It left nothing but ash and awe. The people fell on their faces. The lie was dead. The pattern had spoken, but the pattern always demands more than spectacle. Elijah had called down fire, yes, but also judgment. The false prophets were slain. A storm broke the drought, and for one moment the northern kingdom trembled at the edge of repentance. Then came Jezebel, powerful, proud. She sent no army, no assassin, just a message. And the prophet who had stared down a nation ran into the wilderness, into despair, into the cave. It was there that the real revelation came, not in the wind that tore rocks apart, not in the earthquake that split the ground, not in the fire, but in the whisper, a sound that did not shake mountains, but souls. The Most High was not only thunder, he was silence too. Elijah's fire was not just about victory. It was a mirror, a warning, that power can fall from heaven and still be misunderstood, that a nation can see miracles and still choose death, that even the boldest prophets grow weary, and that sometimes the voice of God is not a roar but a breath that breaks the heart. He was not the first to burn, he would not be the last, but on that mountain, before the fire fell, the pattern blazed so clearly that even the stones remembered, and they are still remembering. The enemy came like a tide, ruthless, swollen, unstoppable. Assyria, empire of iron and flame, swept down upon the land with chariots that rattled the bones of cities. One by one, the strongholds of Judah fell. Lachish burned, refugees flooded the hills, and soon only Jerusalem remained, a single city, A flicker in the dark. Inside its walls, King Hezekiah did something no one expected. He did not surrender. He did not flee. He dug. Through bedrock, through fear, through the impossible. Beneath the city, his men carved a tunnel secret, winding wet to bring the spring of Gihon safely within the walls. Water, the source of life, hidden from the eyes of death. But the king did more than dig. He tore down the high places. He smashed the idols. He reopened the temple. And he prayed not as a last resort, but as a declaration, not to be spared, but to be seen. Then came the letter. The Assyrian king sent threats on parchment, inked with arrogance. "No God," it read, "has ever saved a nation from my hand. What makes you think your God is different?" Hezekiah laid the scroll before the altar. He said nothing clever, just this: "You see, Lord, you hear," and heaven answered. That night, no army marched from the city. No swords were raised, no walls breached. But in the stillness, something unseen moved through the enemy camp. And when morning came, 185,000 soldiers did not rise. There was no noise, just silence and death. The angel had passed through once again. The siege was over, but the tunnel remained. A hollow scar beneath Jerusalem, wet with the memory of desperation and faith. Tourists walk it now, water brushing their ankles, unaware of the cries that once echoed through its stone throat. It was not just a feat of engineering. It was a defiance written in limestone, a whisper to future generations. We did not run. We prepared, and we prayed. The Assyrian king returned home. He would later die at the hands of his own sons in a temple of his own God. But Hezekiah lived, not because of his walls, not because of his army, because he trusted the only pattern that ever holds: humble defiance, hidden faith, and the kind of silence that shakes empires. The tunnel still flows. And so does the story. They found it during renovations, tucked behind stones coated in centuries of dust. A scroll weathered, curled at the edges, asleep in silence. No one knew how long it had lain there beneath the decay of forgetfulness, beneath layers of neglect and compromise. It had not been stolen. It had been forgotten, a book of law, a mirror, a warning. When the words were read aloud to the young king, he did not nod politely. He tore his clothes. His name was Josiah, and though his hands were still clean, he saw blood, not on the scroll, but on the throne, the altars, the very streets outside the temple. This was no ordinary reading. It was a verdict against his fathers, against the nation, against himself. Josiah didn't blink. He didn't wait. He went to war. The high places came down first. Every shrine built on every hill, every Asherah pole, every idol tucked into corners of sacred ground, he reduced them to dust. Priests of foreign gods were removed from their stations. Bones of false prophets were exhumed and burned. The ash of rebellion swept like a storm across the land. And then he went further. He desecrated the altar at Bethel, the very place where golden calves once stood. He didn't just cleanse the temple, he rewrote the script. He reinstated the Passover, the blood-marked doorways, the memory of rescue through judgment. For Josiah, it wasn't just reform, it was reversal, a desperate attempt to halt the spiral. But the scroll had said more. It had whispered of curses, of exile, of consequences stored up like thunderclouds. The prophetess Huldah gave him no comfort. "Because your heart was tender," she said, "you will not see the disaster," meaning, it will still come. And so Josiah, despite all he tore down, despite the scroll's rediscovery, would not stop the storm, only delay it. His reforms were real, fierce, beautiful, but too late. The book had been buried too long. The people had wandered too far. Still, he kept going, and in the end, It was not idols or foreign armies that felled him, but a battlefield he never should have entered. Pharaoh's army was passing through. Josiah tried to stop them. An arrow found its mark. He died before the exile, before the temple's fall, before Babylon. But he died with the scroll in his heart, with ashes on his hands, and with the knowledge that sometimes revival isn't rescue, it's resistance. A final stand in a pattern already written. The book was buried, but once read, it could not be unread, and wrath, once delayed, still remembered its path. They came with fire. Iron-shod boots crushed the last olive branches of peace. Babylon didn't knock, it roared. The walls of Jerusalem groaned as siege after siege fell like a drumbeat of inevitability. And then, one night, the temple opened its mouth and screamed, not in words, in smoke. The temple, the house where heaven touched earth, burned from the inside out. Gold melted, priests wept, blood soaked the outer courts. The sacred was made ash, and the ark, silent, untouched for generations, was no longer there. Whether hidden, taken, or swallowed into legend, it was gone. The throne of God on earth vanished without a sound. Zedekiah fled. They caught him. His sons were slaughtered before his eyes, and then those eyes were taken too. A king led blind into the darkness of exile. The last thing he saw was everything he lost. But the chains didn't start in Babylon. They began long before, in hearts that hardened, in ears that stopped listening, in altars that welcomed other gods. Babylon only harvested what had already withered. The exiles walked in silence, heads bowed, shoulders broken. They had names once tied to land, tribes, inheritance. Now they were numbers in a foreign ledger. The city that was supposed to be eternal now lay in rubble, and the people chosen to carry the name of God were scattered like seeds in foreign soil. But something strange happened in exile. They remembered, not just the grief but the pattern. They began to write. They began to gather stories. Genesis, Exodus, the prophets, the songs of David, the warnings of Moses. Words became anchors, laws became lifelines. And even though the temple was gone, a new sanctuary began to rise, one built not with stone, but with scripture. The prophets spoke still. Ezekiel saw wheels within wheels. Daniel dreamed of beasts and kingdoms. Jeremiah wept with such clarity that his tears turned to prophecy. And somewhere deep in Babylon's shadow, the question began to rise like smoke from old incense. Could the pattern be broken? Or was it already written? They sang the songs of ascent. They faced Jerusalem when they prayed, even as Babylon towered behind them. And though they were slaves again, their story had not ended, because exile in the Bible is never just punishment. It is purification, fire that doesn't just destroy, it reveals. And when the chains fall, what returns to the land is not the same. The temple burned, the ark vanished, but the voice never stopped speaking. Even in Babylon, even in chains, in the silence of Babylon's courts, Daniel dreamt. But these were not ordinary dreams. They were layered like veils over reality, visions that peeled back time itself. In the shadows of a lion's den and the echo of golden idols, he saw something the kings could not. Kingdoms rising, kingdoms falling, and something else watching from above. A statue with a head of gold, chest of silver, thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of clay. Not just a symbol, but a timeline, a code written in metal and conquest. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and something brittle in the end. The vision wasn't merely political, it was celestial. A stone, not cut by human hands, would strike it all down. A kingdom not built by men would replace everything. Later, he saw beasts, 4 of them. One like a lion with eagle's wings, one like a bear raised on one side, one like a leopard with 4 heads, and the last, terrible, unnatural, with iron teeth and 10 horns. From this final creature, a smaller horn emerged, arrogant and cunning, speaking words no man should dare utter. Daniel trembled, not from fear of Babylon's spears or the fire of their furnaces, but from what he saw behind the curtain of history. There was a clock ticking, not in seconds but in empires, and each movement of power was being watched, counted, weighed. He spoke of weeks, 70 of them, not days of the week, but prophetic cycles, weeks that symbolized years, periods of return, rebuilding, waiting, and something coming at the end. A ruler would arrive, be cut off. Then destruction would return, not just to cities but to hopes, and always hidden within the dreams were watchers, not kings, not angels, but something older. Daniel called them by name, the watchers who descended, the holy ones who rendered verdicts, a heavenly court seated in judgment, books opened, flames issuing forth from thrones, justice not just for Israel, but for all the nations and the powers behind them. Even in exile, even surrounded by idols and foreign tongues, Daniel glimpsed the machinery of heaven turning, slowly, precisely, and when a hand wrote on the palace wall, weighed, measured, and found lacking, the king fell that very night, because the countdown had already started. Daniel didn't just survive Babylon. He read its expiration date, and through his visions, he whispered to future generations that the pattern was not chaos. It was design. The end was never improvisation. It was scheduled, and the watchers were already watching. The exiles came back with calloused hands and tired eyes. They carried stones, scrolls, and memory. The land was the same, but something was missing. Jerusalem's walls rose again. The altar was rebuilt, and the priests resumed their chants, but the fire never fell. The ark was gone. The cloud did not return. The temple stood, but heaven stayed silent. Ezra came not with a sword, but with a scroll. He was not a warrior or a king. He was a scribe, a man of letters in a time of longing. And yet, through ink and parchment, he would shape the soul of a scattered people. Because if the presence would not return in fire, then the people must be remade in word. He opened the law like it was a buried treasure. Line by line, he read it aloud in the public square. Men wept, women trembled, children stared wide-eyed. It wasn't just law, it was identity. A forgotten mirror held up to a face bruised by exile. The words hit harder than any sword. They remembered who they were, and who they were meant to be. But the danger hadn't passed. It had only changed. No longer empires of stone and spear, but foreign customs, strange gods, interwoven marriages, and quiet drift. Ezra tore his garments, pulled his hair, fell to the ground. It wasn't about race, it was about erosion. If they blurred the line between covenant and culture, then the return meant nothing. The exile would continue internally. So Ezra drew lines, harsh ones, painful ones. He called for separation, purity, a reset, not just of geography, but of spirit. He wasn't rebuilding a city. He was rebuilding a people, one verse at a time. And then something strange began to happen. Scrolls were copied. Synagogues appeared. The people no longer depended on a king or a prophet. They carried the word. They studied it, memorized it, taught it to their children. A portable holiness. A faith that could no longer be burned down or exiled away. But even then, something still ached. The Shekinah, the visible glory, had not returned. The second temple stood, but it did not shake. The cherubim did not speak. The veil was there, but behind it, only silence. Ezra had given them memory, discipline, identity, but not presence. The covenant was reread, re-sworn, re-inscribed, but the voice from the mountain no longer thundered. The pattern held. Renew. It was not the end, only the pause before a whisper. A silence heavy with waiting. A script still missing its final line. The stones were scattered like bones. The gates were burned. The wall that once held back chaos now whispered its defeat with every gap. And Nehemiah, a man who had tasted the luxury of a foreign court, wept like a father mourning a forgotten child. He had not grown up in Jerusalem, but something in him knew this wall was more than defense. It was memory. It was covenant. And without it, the city would bleed again. He asked permission from a pagan king. He fasted. He prayed. Then he came not with armies, but with resolve sharpened by sorrow. And when he walked those ruined streets, he did not see rubble. He saw resurrection. But as always, the pattern resisted. As soon as he lifted a stone, enemies rose with it. Mockery, threats, sabotage. They laughed at the idea that this broken remnant could ever stand again. But Nehemiah was not rebuilding for applause. He was rebuilding for return. So they worked with one hand and held swords with the other. Builders became soldiers. Priests became guards. The line between sacred and survival blurred beneath the dust and Sunday. The wall climbed higher stone after stone, but so did the tension. Every generation seems to have its Egypt, its Babylon, its wilderness. This one had Sanballat, Tobiah, and the echo of failure. And then, when the wall was sealed and the gates were hung, Nehemiah turned inward. He saw a people drifting again. Foreign marriages, unpaid tithes, forgotten Sabbaths, a slow leak in the soul of the nation. They had rebuilt the wall, but not the will. So he fought again, not with bricks, but with discipline. He rebuked, he tore robes, he drove out compromise. He reminded them of covenant, not just what it protected, but what it demanded. Because without obedience, walls are just rocks. Without faith, the temple is just a building. Nehemiah's story ends not in triumph, but in tension. He rebuilt what had been torn down, but the fire never returned. The throne sat empty. Prophets fell silent. They had come back home, but heaven had not yet answered. The wall stood, the city breathed, but the pattern, the terrifying pattern, still echoed. Build, fall, return, forget. A cycle as old as Eden. And Nehemiah, in his final prayer, does not boast. He pleads, "Remember me, my God, for good," because even in the shadow of restoration, the silence was growing, a storm behind the veil, and the next voice to break it would not come from stone or scroll, but from a cry in the wilderness. A king drinks too much. A queen refuses to dance. A crown is cast aside, and an empire begins to shift without knowing why. Somewhere in the vast sprawl of Persia, a young Jewish girl is pulled into a current no one sees coming. Her name is Hadassah, but the palace calls her Esther, a name that means star, a light hidden in shadow. There is no burning bush, no parted sea, no voice from the whirlwind. In the book that bears her name, God is never mentioned, not once. And yet his fingerprints are everywhere on the timing, the whispers, the restless nights. The entire story is a stage play where the divine director stays behind the curtain. A plot begins to form. Haman, a man swollen with power, plans genocide with a grin. He draws lots to pick the day of slaughter. He builds a gallows. He bribes the king with silver. And the decree is signed with the ring of authority. But what Haman does not see, what he cannot see, is that heaven has already placed a counterweight inside the very throne room he controls. Mordecai, Esther's cousin, tears his garments and sends word, not to the king, to her. She resists at first. The risk is too high. Death waits behind the law. No one approaches the king uninvited. But then comes the moment that will echo forever. If you remain silent now, deliverance will come from somewhere else. But who knows? Maybe you were born for this. Esther fasts. not for beauty, not for favor, for courage, for clarity. She walks toward the throne uninvited, unarmed, and fully aware of what the scepter could deny. But it lowers, grace extends, and the web begins to untangle. She does not demand, she invites. A dinner, then another. Meanwhile, the king cannot sleep. A sleepless night leads to an old record, a forgotten act of loyalty. Mordecai is honored. Haman's pride is pierced. The irony tightens like a noose. When the moment comes, she does not flinch. She names the threat. She unmasks the villain. And the gallows meant for her people becomes the end of their enemy. But still God is not named. The silence is not absence. It is subtlety. A story told in reverse. Deliverance not by miracle but by positioning. Providence dressed as coincidence. A hidden chessboard in a drunken court. Esther stands as proof. Even when heaven says nothing, it is not doing nothing. Even when the scroll does not shout the divine name, the divine will still breathes through every pause and page. Some victories arrive not with thunder but with timing, and some heroes rise not with swords but with silence, courage, and the wisdom to step into risk when no sign is given. The scrolls went quiet. The prophets ceased. No visions thundered from mountaintops. No voice echoed through temples or wilderness. To the world it seemed heaven had gone silent. But above the silence, war raged in unseen places. The years between Malachi and Matthew were not empty. They were pregnant with pressure, with waiting, with things stirring beneath the surface of empires and souls. The Greeks rose. Alexander's conquest swept through lands where once prophets had walked. He spoke not the language of Moses, but of philosophers and gods with strange names. His empire fractured, and from its pieces came something darker. The Seleucids ruled Jerusalem with an iron breath, and altars to Zeus appeared where only Yahweh had been worshipped. In one moment that split history in two, a pig was sacrificed in the temple defilement drawn in blood. And yet even then, no prophet cried out from the street. But the people did not forget. A fire smoldered in secret places, in caves, in scrolls, in whispered prayers passed from father to son. The Maccabees rose, guerrilla warriors who refused to bow. They struck back with holy fury, reclaiming the temple brick by bloodied brick. The oil burned longer than it should have. And though the miracle is debated, the resistance was real. But still, no prophet came. Meanwhile, angels moved, not with trumpets or songs this time, but with sword and silence. A vision came to Daniel long ago, of beasts, horns, thrones, and battles in the heavens. And those battles had not ended. Thrones shifted on earth because dominions were contending above. Michael stood guard over Israel. Gabriel still carried messages, though none were recorded in public ink. The watchers, once trusted, long exiled, continued to whisper. Some had fallen further still, and their influence was felt. Rome arrived. Order, yes. Roads, yes. But under the order, a suffocating weight. Herod took power not king by birthright, but by politics and paranoia. He rebuilt the temple with gold and stone, but filled it with fear. Blood ran again in Jerusalem, but not for sacrifice, for control. And still, but the silence was not absence. It was incubation. It was the deep breath before the exhale that would shake stars and stir shepherds. The old scrolls still glowed with promise. A voice would cry in the wilderness. A light would rise in Galilee. A king would ride on a donkey. And above the empires, above the silence, wings still beat in time with prophecy. The world thought God had stopped speaking, but the Word was getting ready to speak flesh. They marched into the sanctuary not with reverence, but with mockery. Soldiers of the Seleucid Empire, foreign, armored, sneering, dragged their idols where only holy things had stood. The temple, once filled with incense and the trembling awe of priests, now echoed with laughter and the stench of desecration. An altar built for Yahweh became the stage for sacrifice to Zeus. Pagan blood soaked the stones. A pig's carcass sizzled where sacred offerings had once been laid. Heaven did not thunder in that moment. It watched, but not all were silent. In the hills, a priest named Mattathias refused. He saw a fellow Israelite step forward to offer sacrifice under the sword's demand, and he struck him down. Then he killed the soldier who gave the order. With that act, a fire was lit that no empire could easily snuff out. Mattathias fled to the wilderness with his sons, and there the rebellion was born. They were outnumbered, outarmed, out-resourced, but they were not outwilled. The sons of Mattathias became known as the Maccabees, the Hammerers. They struck in the dark, at night, in alleys, in vineyards, on mountaintops. Every raid was a cry, "The temple will not remain defiled." One son, Judah Maccabee, became the war leader. Under his command, the revolt surged. His men knew the terrain, and more importantly, they knew the stakes. They were not just fighting for land. They were fighting for memory, for covenant, for the space between heaven and earth that had been defiled by foreign boots. Years passed. Blood spilled on both sides. Victories flickered like candles in a windstorm. And then, at last, they took Jerusalem. Weary, bloodied, limping but victorious, they entered the temple with trembling hands and eyes full of fire. The filth was cleared, the altar rebuilt. The golden lampstand, bent and tarnished, was set upright again. Only one flask of oil remained, enough for one night. It burned for 8. Some say it was a miracle, some say legend. But the truth beneath both is this: something had been restored. The light returned not just to the temple, but to the soul of a people. Yet even in triumph, the pattern whispered, because soon the Maccabees became kings, and kings forget. Corruption crept back, power changed hands, and the same priests who had once wept for desecration would later collude with new empires. The temple stood, but the glory that once filled it, the cloud, the voice, the fire did not return. Still, the world turned. Rome watched from the west, and in a village called Bethlehem, a census was coming. The torch that passed from temple to rebels to silence would soon flicker again in the eyes of a child. The roads were paved in stone and blood. Rome's banners flapped above every gate, their eagles staring down from pillars that once bore prayers. The empire had not just conquered land, it had reordered time, trade, language, and power. Its coins carried the face of Caesar. Its law carried the weight of iron, and its peace came by sword point. Into this world stepped a man named Herod, called king, but always a puppet. He did not rule by birthright, he ruled by favor. Rome placed him on the throne, like a shadow cast by a distant flame. His palace in Jerusalem stood tall, ornate, grotesque, a tribute to ambition more than holiness. He rebuilt the temple, yes, but only to silence dissent, not summon glory. The ark was still gone. The voice had not returned. But Herod made it gleam, and still, the people waited. The prophets had been silent for centuries, but their words remained, passed like embers between lips and scrolls. A seed from David, a star rising from the east, a stone uncut by human hands. The faithful watched the skies. The zealots sharpened their blades. The priests kept the rituals going, but the fire behind their eyes was dim. Then came the census. Rome wanted a count not just of people, but of power. Every name written was another tether to the empire. Every coin paid was an offering to Caesar. And so they came, from towns and hills and villages, trudging dusty roads to register. Among them, a carpenter and his pregnant wife. No crown, no escort, no palace doors flung open to receive them. Just a borrowed stable. Just the breath of animals. just a cry that split the night. Heaven had begun its invasion, but not with legions, not with chariots, with flesh, with silence, with the heartbeat of a newborn echoing in a cave while Rome slept and Herod fumed. Because Herod had heard rumors. Foreign men from the East, watchers of stars, had come asking questions no king wants to hear. Where is he who has been born king of the Jews? Not appointed, not crowned, born. Herod smiled at them and sent them on. But inside, something old stirred, a pattern he did not understand, a fear older than his throne. The slaughter that followed was not madness. It was calculation. Kill the children. Silence the future. End the whisper before it becomes a roar. But one child slipped away, down into Egypt, land of bondage turned refuge. Just as Israel once escaped Pharaoh, now the true Israel would return from exile once more. Rome did not notice. Herod died. The census was filed. The world moved on. But the countdown had begun. Not to revolt, but to revelation. Something ancient had awakened, and it was wrapped not in armor, but in swaddling clothes. He didn't wear silk. He didn't speak from scrolls. His words cracked through the dry air like thunder rolling across the Judean hills. Wild eyes, coarse camel hair, honey stuck in a rough beard, and always the same cry, "Repent, for the kingdom is near." They came to him, one by one, from villages and cities, soldiers and tax collectors, temple guards and fishermen. Not because he promised healing, not because he handed out bread, but because something ancient echoed in his voice. It wasn't what he said, it was who they remembered. Elijah, Amos, the raw prophets, the ones who did not knock before entering. He was born under strange stars. His father, a priest, had fallen silent the moment the angel spoke. His mother, too old to bear a child, had felt life stir anyway. The neighbors whispered, the scrolls rustled, and when he was born, his name was not chosen by tradition, but declared, John. He did not go to the temple. He went to the river. The Jordan had always meant something. It had parted for Joshua. It had been crossed by prophets. It marked the edge of promise, and the beginning of something new. Now it stirred again as this wild man plunged people beneath its surface and raised them up, dripping, gasping, changed, not washed in ritual purity, baptized in warning. Because John was not gentle, he called the priests a brood of vipers. He told the soldiers to stop stealing. He told the crowds to share their food or face the axe. And behind every word, a shadow loomed, one greater than him. One whose sandals he said he wasn't worthy to untie, one who would baptize not with water but with fire. They asked him, again and again, are you the one? He shook his head. I am a voice, he said, a voice crying in the wilderness. Make the paths straight, make the heart ready. The kingdom is not waiting. It is already at the edge. And then it happened, one morning, as the light cracked over the horizon and the reeds whispered in the breeze, a man stepped into the river. No crown, no scroll, no army. Just eyes that had seen eternity. John paused. You come to me? But the man insisted. And as he rose from the water, the sky split not like thunder, but like heaven breathing. A voice, this time not from the wilderness, but from above. This is my son. And the Spirit descended not with fire, not with fury, but like a dove. The pattern had repeated. The warning had been given. But this time, the messenger did not just prepare the way. This time, the way had stepped into the world. He was born beneath a sky that whispered of war, under the rule of a foreign empire, into the arms of a girl barely old enough to be called woman. No throne, no trumpets, just the cry of a newborn piercing through the straw and the stink of animals. And yet, angels sang, shepherds knelt, and somewhere far away, stargazers set out to follow light carved into night. The words spoken in the beginning, thundered from mountains, whispered by prophets, had now taken form, not as a scroll, not as flame, as flesh, fragile, growing, breathing flesh. They named him Jesus. The temple priests didn't notice. Rome didn't flinch. The world had seen so many births, so many poor, so many claims. But this one was different, because it wasn't just a child, it was the pattern itself. Wearing skin, he slipped through the world unseen for years. Learned the grain of wood under Joseph's hand, ate bread kneaded by his mother, watched Rome's eagles flutter above Jerusalem. And when the time came, he didn't ride in with swords. He walked to the river, baptized not for repentance but as a signal. The heavens opened again, not to give laws but to give affirmation. And then the wilderness called him. 40 days. The same number that echoed through generations, reigns, wanderings, judgments. But this time, no golden calf waited at the end. No grumbling crowds. Just silence, hunger, and the voice that first tempted in Eden. If you are the Son, prove it. But he didn't need to. He answered not with thunder, but with scripture. And then he returned. He healed, but not for spectacle. He taught, but not like the scribes. He cast out darkness, but always warned the witnesses to speak of it to no one. He walked through storms. He fed thousands with fragments. He touched lepers. He forgave prostitutes. And everywhere he went, two things followed: wonder and fury. Because those in power saw the danger, not of armies, but of disruption. He redefined purity, challenged tradition. He dined with sinners and called the religious blind. The people loved him. The leaders plotted. Heaven moved. Hell stirred. He wept at tombs. He overturned temple tables. He spoke of a kingdom not of this world, but one that would break this world apart. He was the pattern, but also the interruption. The true temple that would be torn down and raised again. The Lamb who would not escape the knife. The prophet, priest, and king rejected by all three roles. And as the crowds swelled and the signs multiplied, the whisper turned into a storm. Not everyone rejoiced, because when the pattern incarnates, it doesn't come to entertain. It comes to judge. And to bleed. He walked into the wilderness not by mistake, but by design. It was the Spirit that led him there, into a silence older than time, into a desolation where stones outnumbered voices and the sky felt heavy with memory. For 40 days, he ate nothing, and for 40 nights, he was watched. The desert is where patterns are tested. Adam failed in a garden of abundance. Israel failed in a desert of lack. Now, here stood the new Adam, the true Israel, and the old accuser waited. The voice came softly at first, dressed in reason. "You're hungry, turn these stones to bread." But he would not, because his hunger had a purpose, and because real bread does not come from rocks, it comes from the mouth of God. Then a second test: throw yourself from the temple. The angels will catch you. But he did not leap, because spectacle is not proof, and God does not need to be manipulated to show up. Finally, a mountaintop, a vision of kingdoms. Bow once, and they're yours. But he would not bow, because this king did not come to take the world by force, but to redeem it with blood. 3 temptations, 3 refusals. Where Adam fell, he stood. Where Israel grumbled, he trusted. Where others reached, he resisted. It was not just a test of will, it was a reenactment. Eden, Sinai, the golden calf, the grumbling, the serpents, all of it echoed here. And yet, something new stirred beneath the repetition. This was not just survival, it was reversal. The wilderness had always been a place of exposure, of trial. But for him, it became a proving ground. Not to show what he could do, but to show what he would not. He left that wilderness thin, sunburnt, scarred with dust, but undefeated, and the enemy fled not forever, but for now. The pattern had changed. 40 days of hunger to prepare for 3 years of feeding others. 40 nights of silence before a ministry that would shake the heavens. Temptation resisted so that grace could be offered. The wilderness is where stories unravel or begin again. This one had just begun. He was nailed to the wood at the place of the skull. The crowd jeered, the sky dimmed, and the earth began to remember. It had begun in a garden with a tree, a serpent, and a lie. Now, in full view of mocking eyes and blood-stained ground, the pattern was being rewritten. This was not justice, it was reversal. The innocent condemned, the guilty released. A king crowned with thorns, a throne made of splinters, hands once known for healing, now pinned open in agony, feet that had walked water now fixed to stone. They called it execution, but heaven called it restoration, because the curse that once grew in Eden, "You will surely die," was now uprooted and placed on one man's shoulders. The tree of death became the tree of life, but only through unbearable suffering. And the garden that had once been locked was now being reopened, but not yet for everyone. Even in his final breath, the pattern flickered. A thief beside him whispered hope, and was told he would wake in paradise. Soldiers cast lots, blind to the prophecy their hands fulfilled. The veil in the temple, thick, ancient, separating man from God, was torn from top to bottom, not from earth to heaven, but from heaven to earth. God made the first move. This was not weakness. This was war. He did not fight with a sword, but with surrender. He did not ascend by climbing, but by lowering himself beneath the weight of all things broken. And in doing so, he inverted everything. The last became first. The cursed became blessed. The shameful became sacred. But it was not for all. Not yet, because even a gift this costly must still be received. The reversal is real, but it does not override. It invites. It waits. And so the cross stands not just as a symbol of death, but as a question, not just of what was done, but for whom. A tree was once the site of the fall. Now, a tree becomes the place of rising, but only for some. It happened in the same breath he gave up. A cry that split the air, followed by silence too deep to measure. In the temple, far from the hill of execution, something ancient and sacred was being undone. The veil, thick as a man's hand, woven for centuries to separate divine presence from human defilement, tore, not from below, but from above. Heaven made the first rip. This was not a curtain. It was a cosmic boundary. Behind it had always been fire, cloud, and warning. Only one man, once a year, with blood and trembling, dared enter. Now the path stood open, raw, exposed, and permanent. Not through ritual, but through death. Not by law, but by sacrifice. But as the veil tore, so did the pattern, because for the first time, access came not by priesthood, lineage, or obedience, but by grace. And yet, this new openness did not cancel the warning. It intensified it. For every door opened by love also becomes a gate of judgment when rejected. The old story had always repeated. Sin leads to exile. Rebellion invites wrath. Mercy comes at a cost. That story didn't end here. It escalated. The tearing of the veil was not just permission, it was a reckoning. Because what once shielded humanity from holy fire was now gone. There was no longer a barrier between man and God, which meant there was also no longer a barrier between God and man's choices. Some rejoiced, others recoiled. Even the earth responded. Stones cracked, tombs opened, darkness fell at midday. Creation remembered something the crowd had forgotten. This was not just a man. This was the hinge of the universe. And now, with the veil torn, every moment after would carry a sharper edge. Revelation would demand response. Proximity would demand purity. Grace would demand gratitude or reveal rebellion. The old pattern of covering was over. What remained was exposure. Heaven opened. But judgment had begun. It began in waiting. Not in fire or thunder, not with armies or kings, but in a room filled with breathless hope and unresolved fear. They had seen him alive. They had touched his wounds. They had watched him ascend, and they remembered the words. So they waited. 10 days of prayer, silence, and whispers of what might come next. Then, without warning, heaven roared again, not at a mountain, not behind a veil, but into them. The fire fell not to destroy, but to ignite. It split like tongues and rested on each one. Not one man for a nation. Every man, every woman, now became a vessel. And with that fire came a voice, a sound older than Babel, but now made new. They spoke. And the world understood. Every language, every tribe, every scattered tongue that once marked judgment now became a conduit of grace. What had been divided at the tower was being reunited not through empire, but through spirit. This was not a reversal of culture. It was a baptism of purpose. And yet, it echoed something older, because once again, wind had moved over a gathering of flesh. Once again, breath entered dust. But this time, it did not just create life. It created boldness. Those who had hidden behind locked doors now stood in public squares. Those who had once denied now declared. And what they declared was dangerous. The pattern had turned inside out. Where the law brought fear, the Spirit brought intimacy. Where the temple held secrets, the Spirit brought revelation. Where once only prophets heard, now fishermen preached. Where once only priests offered sacrifice, now common hands healed the sick and broke bread with trembling joy. And it was not safe, because power never island. Pentecost was not a gentle blessing. It was an invasion, a wildfire of heaven's presence burning through the barriers of race, class, gender, and history. It spread from Jerusalem to Judea, then out into Rome, and finally into every corner where language had once been confused. And it still burns. This was not just revival. It was reclamation. The same spirit that hovered at creation now moved through broken humans, stitching together what sin had torn apart. And every tongue that spoke that day was a dagger in the heart of darkness. The fire fell again. But this time, it did not consume. It called. Chains clinked when he moved, but his voice still thundered. Paul, once the hunter of believers, now wrote with ink that burned hotter than the fires that forged Rome's swords. He was caged, beaten, forgotten by many, but heaven still dictated through his pen. The walls of his prison were stone, but the words he sent out shattered empires. They were letters, yes, but not ordinary ones. These weren't mere updates or philosophical essays. They were battlefield instructions. They were revelations forged in pain, written in dim cells, under the watch of Roman guards. Each line carried weight heavier than iron, and they were sent not just to churches, but to souls scattered across time. A blueprint for a body not built with stone. Grace, faith, unity. The old covenant had thundered from Sinai. The new one echoed from chains. Paul did not write as one trying to escape suffering. He wrote as one transfigured by it. His sight, once proud and fleshly, had been scorched by light on a Damascus road. He had tasted blindness and was reborn with different eyes. Eyes that saw mystery where others saw madness. Eyes that looked at Gentiles and saw family. That looked at the cross and saw a throne. That looked at prison and still saw victory. Each city he wrote to was battling its own darkness, Corinth drowning in pride, Galatia haunted by old rules, Philippi battered by persecution, Ephesus wrestling unseen forces. Yet Paul's message remained maddeningly clear. The pattern hasn't changed. Struggle, fall, call out, be rescued. And now, the rescuer had come in flesh and would dwell in them by spirit. He reminded them what had already been done, that death had been crushed not just in theory, but in flesh and history. That grace was not weakness, it was the force that toppled thrones and shattered ancient curses. That suffering was no longer punishment, it was participation. Paul's chains were not a contradiction to the message. They were the message. He wrote of armor not made of steel, of battles fought in prayer, of victories claimed not in palaces but in tears. And when the letters were read aloud, something ancient stirred again. It was as if Sinai rumbled once more. Not from outside, but within hearts, now made holy. These prison letters were not the end of Paul. They were the multiplication. Stone walls could not hold back the words of a man who had seen Christ and would not be silent. And in the flicker of candlelight, across crowded homes and whispered readings, the words lived on, still do. In the final vision, the end looks strangely like the beginning, but sharper, louder, heavier with meaning. Revelation is not a new story. It is the old story, uncoiled and revealed in full. Eden wasn't lost. It was postponed. The serpent reappears, but this time he is not subtle. No whisper behind leaves, no fruit to tempt. He rises in the open, crowned with deception, roaring across nations and wearing the skin of empires. He bleeds power, but even in his blasphemy, he is predictable. It is the same rebellion as the garden, the same hunger for a throne, the same war against the image of God etched in human breath. But this time, something else returns. A tree no longer guarded by flaming swords, but flanked by a river that runs through the heart of the city. Its leaves are for healing. Its roots never wither. It is not just the tree of life, it is the fulfillment of it. What was once lost behind exile and curse now stands at the center of restoration. And the garden, yes, it returns too. But it is no longer wild and vulnerable. It has walls. It has light that never dims. It has a throne. The garden becomes a city, and the city becomes a temple, and the temple becomes God dwelling with his people again. No priests, no veils, no separation. There are echoes everywhere. The dragon cast down mirrors the serpent cursed to the dust. The bride clothed in radiance echoes the woman formed from Adam's side. The voice that once walked in the cool of the day now declares, "Behold, I make all things new." And when he speaks, time itself folds. Revelation does not erase Genesis. It was never just about Eden. It was about return, restoration, redemption that moves forward, not backward. The garden was a beginning, but the city is a completion. The serpent's head is crushed, not with a stone, but with a name that no one else can wear. The Lamb reigns, not with violence, but with scars. And the curse? Gone. No more death, no more mourning, no more night. The story was never random. The pattern, for all its terror and judgment, always carried a promise. From tree to tree, from garden to garden, from fall to restoration, every cycle was leading here. To the day when the pattern would break in the best way possible. Not with silence, but with singing. Forever. She is clothed with the sun, standing on the moon, crowned with 12 stars. She cries out in pain, not just from labor, but from knowing what stalks her, something ancient, coiled, and watching. The dragon waits at her feet, jaws open, hoping to devour the child the moment it breaks into the world. But the child is caught up, the woman flees, and heaven catches fire. This is no ordinary birth, and this is no ordinary enemy. What plays out in the vision is not bound to one place or one time. It stretches backward to Eden and forward to the final trumpet. A woman, a dragon, a son, destined to rule it is the pattern told through the stars, retold in heaven's war room, refracted through history's prism. Michael rises. The archangel who once stood silently at the river now unsheathes his sword. The war is not metaphor. The war is movement, a casting out, a falling down. The dragon is not merely resisted, he is thrown. And when he falls, the earth trembles, not from the weight of his body, but from the fury he carries with him, because he knows So the woman runs, not just as a mother, but as a symbol. She is Israel. She is Eve. She is Mary. She is the faithful remnant. She is every soul who has ever carried the seed of promise while darkness hunted her steps. Wings are given, a wilderness prepared, nourishment provided. The earth opens its mouth to swallow the flood sent after her. Even the ground rebels against the accuser, but the dragon doesn't give up. He wages war on her other children, those who keep the commandments, those who hold the testimony. He turns his rage toward flesh and bone. And still, the pattern expands. Because this is no longer just about one garden or one covenant. The pattern zooms out. Now it is cosmic. It is blood and stars and prophecy colliding with empire. And yet, even in that vastness, even in that terror, the child is still safe. The throne is still occupied. And the woman is still protected. The heavens declare more than glory. They declare war. And in that war, victory does not look like conquest. It looks like testimony. It looks like not loving life even unto death. It looks like a remnant holding on not to their safety, but to their song. The pattern zooms out. But the promise holds. The beast does not rise with fangs. It rises with policy, with smooth language, with alliances, with incentives that make you smile, and punishments that make you bend. The vision begins with a dragon, but it ends with something far more familiar, an empire that doesn't ask for loyalty. It demands it. It rewards convenience and labels resistance as rebellion. And somewhere in the machinery, a number begins to whisper. Not just 6, not just 60, not just 600, but something layered, something patterned, something ancient and recursive. It is the number of a man, but also the echo of systems that have always measured human value in terms of obedience. You cannot buy, you cannot sell, you cannot move unless you wear its mark. And the mark is not always a tattoo or a chip. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is agreement with something you know is wrong, but say yes to anyway because saying no would cost too much. Sometimes the mark is invisible to others but seared into your soul. The beast doesn't look like a monster. It looks like safety, like unity, like logic, like one world, one voice, one standard. It promises peace, but it crushes dissent. It mimics miracles. It dazzles the naive. It even builds something holy, an image, a symbol, a counterfeit presence. And then it animates it, breathes into it, forces the world to worship what it has made. Those who refuse are labeled threats. John saw all this in exile, long before it arrived, before the satellites, before the databases, before the algorithms. He saw the bones of the system, not the skin. The number is a warning, not because it is magic, but because it is a cipher. It encodes something deeper, the fusion of empire, idolatry, and identity, a trinity in mockery of the real one, the beast from the sea, the beast from the earth, the image that speaks. And still, a remnant refuses. They are not loud, but they are clear. They sing songs that no one else can learn. They follow the Lamb, even when it means death. They are not marked by convenience, but by covenant, and the beast hates them for it. The number of the beast is not just about the end. It is about every moment when the pattern offers you a false god in exchange for your silence. The number counts more than digits. It counts choices. The beast does not rise with fangs. It rises with policy, with smooth language, with alliances, with incentives that make you smile, and punishments that make you bend. The vision begins with a dragon, but it ends with something far more familiar, an empire that doesn't ask for loyalty. It demands it. It rewards convenience. and labels resistance as rebellion. And somewhere in the machinery, a number begins to whisper, not just 6, not just 60, not just 600, but something layered, something patterned, something ancient and recursive. It is the number of a man, but also the echo of systems that have always measured human value in terms of obedience. You cannot buy. You cannot sell. You cannot move unless you wear its mark. And the mark is not always a tattoo or a chip. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is agreement with something you know is wrong, but say yes to anyway because saying no would cost too much. Sometimes the mark is invisible to others but seared into your soul. The beast doesn't look like a monster. It looks like safety, like unity, like logic, like one world, one voice, one standard. It promises peace, but it crushes dissent. It mimics miracles. It dazzles the naive. It even builds something holy, an image, a symbol, a counterfeit presence. And then it animates it, breathes into it, forces the world to worship what it has made. Those who refuse are labeled threats. John saw all this in exile, long before it arrived, before the satellites, before the databases, before the algorithms. He saw the bones of the system, not the skin. The number is a warning, not because it is magic, but because it is a cipher. It encodes something deeper, the fusion of empire, idolatry, and identity. A trinity in mockery of the real one. The beast from the sea, the beast from the earth, the image that speaks, and still a remnant refuses. They are not loud, but they are clear. They sing songs that no one else can learn. They follow the Lamb, even when it means death. They are not marked by convenience, but by covenant. And the beast hates them for it. The number of the beast is not just about the end. It is about every moment when the pattern offers you a false god in exchange for your silence. The number counts more than digits. It counts choices. It looks nothing like the first one. No towers reaching for the clouds. No ziggurats carved in sun-baked stone. And yet, its soul is the same. Babylon returns not as a single city, but as a global intoxication. Gold, spice, silk, oil, data, whatever is most desired. Babylon trades in it. But it never gives without taking something more. Behind the glittering markets and polished walls is always the same altar, the same price, the same blood. This is not a kingdom built on justice. It is a machine fueled by exploitation. The poor are crushed under invisible gears. The prophets are mocked. The truth is bought, edited, and resold. And the merchants? They weep only when the prophets stop, not when the innocents fall. John saw it all from Patmos, in visions that blurred the line between symbol and structure. He watched the woman clothed in purple, holding a golden cup filled with filth. He heard her call herself queen, untouched by sorrow, and he saw what followed. A burning, a fall, a silence. He called it mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. Not because she sold bodies, though she did, but because she sold worship. She offered comfort in exchange for loyalty, distraction in place of devotion, and the world drank deeply. Kings climbed into her bed, nations bowed at her feet, and still, the saints cried out beneath the altar. How long? The answer came not with delay, but with patience. Mercy first, warnings next. And then, suddenly, the collapse isn't gradual. It's instant. In a single hour, the empire that seemed invincible is broken. Her wealth turns to smoke. Her songs stop. Her light flickers out. And those who profited from her stand far off, watching, mourning not her sins but their loss. Heaven doesn't mourn. Heaven rejoices, because the pattern ends here. The tower falls. The harlot is judged. and the blood she spilled is remembered. Every silenced voice, every crushed witness, every prophet slain in the streets. Their cries rise like incense. And justice answers. Babylon is more than a city. It is every system that mocks truth and monetizes the sacred. It is every empire that wraps idolatry in law and calls it progress. But it cannot stand forever. The fall of Babylon is not just a prophecy, it is a promise. And in the silence that follows her ruin, another sound begins to rise, a song, distant but growing. Something new is about to be built, not by men reaching upward, but by heaven coming down. It begins again, but not as before. Not a garden hidden in the eastern hills of some ancient land. Not a fragile paradise threatened by a whispering serpent. This garden descends. It is not built from soil, but from glory. From a voice that says, "Behold, I make all things new." No temple now, because the presence no longer hides behind curtains or pillars. No sun, because light himself is among them. No night, no death, no tears, because the curse has unraveled. The ground no longer groans. The tree of life, once sealed away by cherubim and flame, now stretches its roots into the heart of the new creation. Its fruit is for all. Its leaves heal what history could not. But even here, something watches. At the edge of this radiant city flows a river, clear as crystal. Along its banks, the memory of what came before hums like a warning. Eden was not lost by accident. It was given away, bargained for a lie. And though this garden will never fall, it is not unguarded. The gates are always open, but nothing unclean may enter. The choice remains, even here. Those who thirst come and drink, but outside the gates still linger those who refuse. Even paradise does not erase the will. This final garden is not a return, it is a fulfillment. What began with dust and breath ends with glory and permanence. The serpent has no place here. His voice is gone. His wound, once fatal, has been healed by a pierced hand. And the tree, once the symbol of rebellion, is now the symbol of restoration. But there is a strangeness to this ending. Joy, yes. Beauty beyond words. Yet also awe, reverent silence. As if even eternity knows what it costs to arrive here. A throne stands at the center. Not empty, not distant. The one seated there bears scars. Forever visible, forever holy. And written on the foreheads of the redeemed is not their shame, but his name. The final garden is not the reward of the good. It is the refuge of the rescued. And though swords no longer hang in the branches, the memory of exile lingers. Not as guilt, but as gratitude. Every leaf whispers it. Every stone hums with it. Every breath of this new world says what the old world could not. The pattern is broken. The gates are open. Come home. You were never just reading history. You were being warned by it. The rise and fall of kingdoms, the building of temples and their collapse, the cries of prophets in desert winds, all of it was pattern, not just memory, but map, not just past, but echo. The stories weren't scattered. They spiraled, over and over, from garden to exile, from covenant to betrayal, from glory to ruin, from ruin to restoration, until now. The flood came once, but the world drowns in different waters now. Pride, distraction, self-made gods. The golden calf looks like progress. The Tower of Babel looks like networking. Egypt has Wi-Fi. Babylon sells advertisements. Rome streams live. But the pattern always the same. Forget, rebel, fall, cry out, be rescued, and forget again. You were not left out of the pattern. You are inside it. The veil tore, fire fell. A tree cursed by Rome became the axis of mercy. And still the pattern did not vanish, it intensified. It pushed outward, into every nation, every language, every screen. But now comes the turn that cannot be reversed, because it was never just a book. It was never just one people's journey. The whole thing was rehearsal. The pattern itself was the prophecy, a code written across centuries, waiting to be recognized. And now the curtain is rising for the final act. You are living in a chapter that was foreshadowed long ago. When justice seemed delayed, it was gathering weight. When mercy seemed too wide, it was gathering witnesses. When silence lingered, heaven was holding its breath. And now it is our turn, not just to observe, but to choose, to walk toward the voice or turn back into the dark, because every previous collapse was a rehearsal for the final invitation. Every past rebellion was a warning carved into time itself. Every rescue whispered a question. Will you remember this time? The trumpet doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be clear. The pattern has spoken, so has the one behind it.